Valentine's Eve in Seoul wasn't a celebration, it was a sentence. Park Jin-wook stood motionless in his Gangnam penthouse, the skyline of the city blurring into neon streaks behind the rain-pelted glass. The room was a graveyard of red, thousands of roses imported from the coast, left in their crates, their scent thick and cloying. They weren't for a celebration, they were for a ghost. Jin-wook had buried his heart 3 years ago in a shallow grave of grief and cold steel. He lived in the silence of his own making. Then the glass shifted. In the dark reflection of the window, he saw a miracle. The same defiant tilt of the head, the same crown of hair that used to slip through his fingers, the same eyes that had been closed forever. His pulse, dead for 3 years, thundered once. He didn't scream. He didn't move. He simply leaned into the shadows of his men and whispered, "Bring her to me." Before we begin, please hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let's dive in. Valentine's Eve smelled like expensive gin and desperation. Talia Nairi Lawson adjusted the heavy lens of her camera, the off-shoulder strap of her red silk dress digging into her skin. She wasn't here for the champagne or the elite company. She was here because the landlord didn't accept artistic potential as currency. The gala was a sea of false smiles and crystal chandeliers that hung like jagged ice from the ceiling. Talia kept her head down, focusing on her shutter speed. That was how you survived a room full of predators. You became invisible. Then the room changed. It didn't get louder, it went cold. The laughter stopped mid-breath. The musicians faltered. Security teams in sharp black suits snapped to attention with the precision of a firing squad. Talia felt the weight of a gaze before she saw the man. Park Jin-wook stood at the edge of the balcony, a king looking over a kingdom he was ready to burn. She made the mistake of looking up. Their eyes locked and the air left the room. For the first time in his life, the man who controlled Seoul forgot how to speak. And Talia realized that tonight she wasn't just the photographer, she was the prize. The golden light of the hotel ballroom felt more like a spotlight than an invitation. Talia Nairi Lawson shifted the weight of her camera bag, feeling the silk of her red off-shoulder dress rustle against her skin. It was a beautiful dress, a thrifted treasure she'd saved for a night like this. But standing amidst the elite of Seoul, she felt the familiar, sharp edges of being an outsider. Her natural afro, coiled in a tight, crown-like halo, drew glances that ranged from curiosity to cold indifference. She didn't mind. She was here for the shots, not the small talk. She moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of a shadow, capturing the glittering jewelry and the forced laughter of men who owned half the skyline. Each click of the shutter was a step closer to making rent. That was her reality, survival dressed in satin. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the hundreds of red roses that lined the walls. It was a romantic's dream, but to her, it smelled like a heavy, suffocating kind of wealth. Talia paused near a towering marble pillar to check her exposure settings. For a moment, she allowed herself to look up, her gaze wandering toward the VIP balconies that overlooked the floor. That's when the temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She felt it before she saw him, a sudden, electric prickle at the base of her neck. It was the sensation of being watched, not by a casual passerby, but by something focused and predatory. She turned her head slowly, her eyes climbing the shadows of the mezzanine until they landed on a figure standing by the rail. He was tall, his athletic build cutting a sharp silhouette against the neon-blurred windows behind him. He wasn't wearing a full suit, just a black vest over a white shirt, a look that felt dangerously casual in this sea of tuxedos. Even from this distance, the dark ink of tattoos crawling up his neck were visible, marking him as a man who lived by his own laws. But it was his face that stopped her heart. He wasn't looking at the crowd, he was looking at her. His gaze wasn't the wandering eye of a flirt or the arrogant stare of a billionaire. It was haunted. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost or a miracle he wasn't prepared for. Talia's fingers froze on her camera. She should have looked away. That was the unspoken rule of surviving rooms filled with men like him. But she found herself trapped in the intensity of his stare. In that moment, the music, the clinking glasses, and the murmurs of the elite faded into a dull hum. She saw his lips move, A soft whisper lost to the distance, directed at the wall of black-suited men standing behind him. One of the men nodded, his eyes immediately dropping to Talia. Panic, cold and sudden, flared in her chest. She had spent years learning how to exist in spaces that weren't made for her by being invisible, but the man on the balcony had just stripped that invisibility away. She gripped her camera tight, her pulse thudding against her ribs. She needed to leave. She needed to fade back into the city rain before the gravity of his gaze pulled her under. But as she turned to retreat toward the exit, she saw three men in dark suits detach themselves from the shadows of the bar, their eyes locked onto her crown of curls with military precision. The hunt had begun, and the ballroom was no longer a party. It was a cage. The heavy glass doors of the ballroom felt miles away. Talia moved with an urgency she tried to mask as professional haste, her camera bag bumping rhythmically against her hip. She didn't look back at the balcony. She didn't need to. The phantom heat of Park Jin-wook's gaze was still searing the skin between her shoulder blades. The air in the hallway was cooler, smelling of floor wax and rain, but the relief was short-lived. The three men she had seen earlier weren't following her. They were intercepting her. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency, cutting off the angles of the corridor until she was forced to a halt near a decorative alcove. "Miss Lawson," the man in the center said. His voice was like a low-frequency hum devoid of any inflection. He didn't ask her name, he stated it. "Our chairman would like a word." Talia pulled her camera bag tighter, her knuckles turning white against the leather strap. "I'm finished for the night. If the chairman wants the proofs, my agency will send them over on Monday." She tried to step around them, but the man on the right shifted, a wall of broad shoulders and expensive wool blocking her path. He didn't touch her, but the threat was implicit. These were not the kind of men who accepted a polite refusal. They were the kind of men who removed obstacles. "It isn't about the photographs," the lead man said, stepping closer. The light of the hallway caught the edge of a silver pin on his lapel, the insignia of the Valent Syndicate's sole branch. "It is a private matter. He is waiting in the motor pool." "I'm not going anywhere," Talia said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain firm. "Move, or I'll start screaming, and I guarantee your chairman doesn't want that kind of press at a charity gala." The lead man's expression didn't flicker. He reached into his jacket, and for a heart-stopping second, Talia thought he was reaching for a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a sleek black smartphone. He pressed a button and held it toward her. "Talia," a voice whispered from the speaker. It wasn't the man in front of her. It was the man from the balcony. The voice was deep, gravelly, and carried a weight of sorrow that felt like a physical pressure. "Please, I have waited 3 years to see that face. Do not make my men be unkind. Just 10 minutes, that is all I ask." The intimacy of the plea was more terrifying than a threat. He spoke as if he knew her, as if they shared a secret history that she had somehow forgotten. Before she could find her breath to argue, the man in front of her gave a subtle nod. "This way, Miss Lawson," he said, his tone shifting from a request to a command. They flanked her, one in front and two behind, forming a human cage of black suits around her red dress. As they led her toward the service elevator, Talia looked at her reflection in the polished gold of the elevator doors. Her afro was still perfectly coiled, her dress still shimmered like a ruby, but her eyes looked back at her with the wide, wild stare of someone who had just stepped off a cliff. The doors slid shut with a silent, final hiss, and as the car began its descent into the bowels of the hotel, she realized that the 10 minutes he promised was a lie. Park Jin-wook hadn't sent for a guest. He had sent for a ghost he intended to keep. The ride up to the penthouse was a blur of silent, rising numbers on a digital display. When the elevator doors finally whispered open, Talia was met not with a room but with an atmosphere. The air here was thinner, colder, and heavy with the scent of rain and white lilies. The space was vast, a glass-walled sanctuary perched high above the neon arteries of Seoul. It was minimally furnished, low-slung leather chairs, polished stone floors, and a darkness that seemed to swallow the light of the city. In the center of the room stood Park Jin-wook. He was silhouetted against a massive window, a single glass of amber liquid in his hand. He didn't turn around immediately, but Talia felt the sudden shift in the room's energy the moment she stepped onto the marble floor. "Leave us," he said. The voice was the same one she'd heard through the phone, but in the open air, it carried a vibration that resonated in her chest. His men bowed with synchronized precision and retreated into the elevator, the doors closing with a finality that made Talia's breath hitch. Jinwook turned, slowly. Talia had prepared herself for a monster, or at least a man who would look at her with the cold calculation of a king inspecting new property. What she wasn't prepared for was the look of absolute, soul-shattering devastation that crossed his features. The glass in his hand tilted precariously as his eyes raked over her, from the crown of her afro to the shimmering red satin of her dress. He didn't speak. He simply stared, his chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged breaths. He walked toward her, his movements fluid and predatory, yet there was a tremor in his hands that betrayed a profound shock. As he stepped into the soft glow of a nearby floor lamp, the tattoos on his neck seemed to writhe like living shadows. Talia took a step back, her heel clicking sharply against the stone. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "And why do you look at me like you've seen a ghost?" Jinwook stopped only a few feet away. He was taller than he'd appeared from the balcony, a mountain of controlled violence and suppressed grief. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering inches from her face, as if he were trying to touch the air she breathed. "Her name was Hana," he said, his voice a low, broken rasp. "She had your stillness, your dignity, and when she turned to look at the rain, she moved exactly as you do." He finally let his hand drop, his gaze locking onto hers with a possessiveness that made her skin crawl even as it ignited a strange, terrifying heat. "I spent 3 years convinced the world had gone gray because she was no longer in it. I spent tonight preparing to say goodbye to her memory. And then I saw you." "I am not her," Talia said, her voice growing stronger with a surge of indignation. "I don't know who you lost, but I am Talia Lawson. I am a photographer. I am a person, not a memory you can just summon because you're lonely." Jinwook stepped even closer, bridging the final gap until she could smell the whiskey and the cold rain on his skin. He looked down at her, his dark eyes searching hers for a spark of recognition that didn't exist. "You are a miracle," he whispered, the intensity of his obsession settling over her like a heavy velvet shroud. "And in this city, miracles are kept, they are protected, they are owned." The word owned hung in the frigid air of the penthouse like a physical weight. Talia felt a shiver of pure, cold adrenaline. She didn't look away from Jinwook. Instead, she tilted her chin up, her afro framing a face that was now set in a mask of defiance. "I am not a piece of art you can hang in your gallery, Mr. Park. You can't own a person." Jinwook didn't blink. The grief that had softened his features moments ago was being systematically replaced by the cold, calculating steel of the man who ruled the soul underworld. He walked to a desk made of dark, obsidian-like wood and picked up a slender file. He didn't look at it. He knew exactly what was inside. "Talia Nairi Lawson," he said, the syllables of her name sounding strange and heavy in his accent. 3 months behind on rent, a student loan debt that is currently in collections, and a dream of a photography studio in the arts district that is currently nothing more than a folder of saved bookmarks on a laptop you can barely afford to keep charged. Talia felt a hot flush of shame. It was one thing to be poor. It was another to have your poverty read back to you like a list of sins by a man who wore a watch worth more than her childhood home. "You've been busy," she snapped. "I am a businessman," Jinwook replied, his voice regaining its rhythmic, commanding edge. He set the file down and leaned against the desk, crossing his tattooed arms. "And I am making you an offer. I do not want your body, Talia. I do not want your soul. I want your presence." He gestured to the vast, empty penthouse. "This city sees me as a man who has lost his edge because I spend my nights mourning a ghost. My rivals smell blood. I need the world to see that Park Jinwook has found something worth protecting again. I need them to see that face at my side." Talia narrowed her eyes. "You want me to be a decoy, a prop?" I want you to be a queen, he corrected, his gaze dropping to the red silk of her dress. In exchange, your debts vanish tonight. Your studio will be leased, fully equipped and funded for 5 years. You will never have to take a job at a gala for rent money again. You will have the life your talent deserves. The silence that followed was thick with the sound of the rain lashing against the glass. It was the devil's bargain, wrapped in the promise of freedom. Talia looked at the man before her, haunted, dangerous, and impossibly powerful. He was offering her everything she had ever worked for, but the price was her invisibility. She would be stepping out of the shadows and directly into the crosshairs of his world. "And if I say no?" she asked. Jinwook stood up straight, the shadows of the room seeming to lengthen behind him. "Then my men will drive you home. You will struggle. You will eventually lose that camera, and I will continue to watch you from the darkness, wondering why a miracle chose to wither when it could have bloomed." He reached out not to touch her but to slide a gold-plated pen across the desk toward her. "The contract is simple, Talia. Stay by my side until the city believes the lie. After that, you are free. Do we have an agreement?" Talia looked at the pen, then at the man who looked at her like she was the only light left in a dark world. She reached out, her fingers trembling only slightly as she gripped the cold metal. "10 minutes was a lie," she whispered. "In my world," Jinwook replied, his voice dropping to a possessive growl, "forever starts with a single second." The golden pen felt like a branding iron against Talia's fingers as she finalized the signature that tethered her life to Park Jin-wook. The ink had barely dried before the reality of her new life began to settle in, thick and suffocating like the scent of the lilies filling the room. Jin-wook didn't move. He stayed anchored to the edge of the obsidian desk, his eyes tracing the line of her jaw with a hunger that made her skin prickle. "Hana would have signed it with more hesitation," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. "She was always more fragile, more like the glass." Talia froze. The name hit her like a physical blow. She set the pen down with a sharp click that echoed off the marble walls. "My name is Talia," she said, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart, "and I am not made of glass." Jin-wook didn't seem to hear her. He stood and walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, the predatory grace of a man who had forgotten how to exist without a target. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he brushed a stray coil of her afro. His touch was cold, yet it burned. "The way you hold your head," he whispered, his dark eyes clouded with a grief so deep it looked like madness. "It's as if she never left, as if the rain finally brought her back to me." Talia stepped back, batting his hand away. The pity she had felt for his mourning curdled into a sharp, bitter indignation. "Stop it," she snapped. "Look at me. Really look at me, Jin-wook. I am a black woman from a different world. I am a photographer. I have a life, a history, and a name that isn't hers. I am not a canvas for you to paint your dead girlfriend on." The atmosphere in the penthouse shifted instantly. The vulnerability in Jin-wook's gaze vanished, replaced by a terrifying, icy stillness. The tattooed dragon on his neck seemed to flex as his jaw tightened. He stepped into her personal space, his height looming over her like a thundercloud. "You signed the contract," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, possessive growl. "You accepted the debt. In the eyes of this city and in this house, you are whatever I need you to be." "Then you bought the wrong woman," Talia shot back, her afro framing her face like a crown of defiance. She refused to shrink beneath his shadow. "You can pay my rent and buy my lenses, but you don't get to overwrite my soul. If you want a ghost, go to the cemetery. If you want me at your side, you will use my name." For a long moment, the only sound was the rhythmic lashing of the rain against the glass. Jin-wook stared at her, his expression unreadable, a battle raging behind his eyes between the man who mourned and the boss who commanded. He had expected a grateful survivor. He had found a fire he hadn't prepared to contain. "Hana never raised her voice," he said quietly, a strange, dark fascination flickering in his eyes. "Then get used to the noise," Talia replied, turning her back on him to look out at the city she had just sold her freedom to. "Because I'm going to be the loudest mistake you've ever made." The silence of the penthouse was shattered not by words, but by the sudden, rhythmic vibration of a phone on the obsidian desk. Jinwook didn't look away from Talia immediately. He lingered on her defiance, a ghost of a frown pulling at his scarred features. When he finally answered, his voice shifted into a dialect of Korean that sounded like serrated steel. The transition was instantaneous. The mourning lover vanished, replaced by the apex predator. "Stay here," he commanded, not looking back as he grabbed a heavy wool overcoat. "I'm not a dog you can tell to stay," Talia countered, her heart hammering against her ribs. If she was going to be trapped in this world, she refused to be blind to it. Before he could object, she grabbed her camera bag and followed him into the private elevator. The car descended into the bowels of the city, surfacing in a restricted loading dock in Incheon. The air here didn't smell like lilies or expensive whiskey. It smelled of salt, diesel, and wet concrete. Rain lashed against the black sedans waiting for them, and for the first time, Talia saw the true scale of the shadow Jinwook cast over Seoul. Dozens of men in identical black suits stood in the downpour, their heads bowed in synchronized reverence as Jinwook stepped out. He didn't lead her to a ballroom. He led her to a rusted warehouse where the light of the moon was filtered through grime-streaked skylights. Inside, a man was tied to a chair, his face a map of bruises. The atmosphere was thick with a cold, clinical violence. Talia's breath hitched, her fingers instinctively clutching the strap of her camera. She had seen poverty and struggle, but she had never seen the raw, unadulterated power of a man who decided who lived and who died. Jinwook didn't shout. He walked up to the man with a terrifying calmness, pulling a pair of leather gloves tight over his knuckles. "You were seen at the gala," Jinwook said, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "You were looking for the miracle I found. You thought she was a weakness." The man in the chair spat blood, a desperate, gargled laugh escaping him. "She looks just like the dead one, Jinwook. The whole city knows you've gone soft for a ghost." The movement was so fast Talia almost missed it. Jinwook's fist connected with the man's jaw with a sickening crack. There was no hesitation, no mercy. He struck again, a methodical, rhythmic brutality that made Talia feel like the room was spinning. This was the man she had signed her life away to, not a grieving soul, but a monster who maintained his throne with blood. Jinwook stopped, his chest barely heaving, and turned to look at Talia. He stood over the broken man, the light catching the blood on his gloves. He looked at her not with the eyes of a lover, but with the eyes of a warning. "This is the heart of Seoul," he said, his voice dropping to that possessive, gravelly tone. "It is cold, it is violent, and now that you wear my mark, they will come for you to get to me." Talia looked at the man on the floor, then at the blood on Jinwook's hands. The red of the gala dress now felt like a target rather than a garment. She raised her camera, the shutter clicking in the hollow warehouse. The flash illuminated the violence for a split second. "Then you better make sure your mark is worth the price," she said, her voice trembling but her gaze unwavering. She had seen the monster now, and the terror was real. But so was the realization that in this cold heart of the city, she was the only thing that made him human. The drive back from Incheon was a heavy, suffocating silence. The neon lights of Seoul smeared against the car windows like wet paint, but inside the leather-bound sanctuary of the SUV, the air was thick with the metallic tang of the warehouse. Jinwook sat in the shadows of the backseat, his gloved hands resting on his knees, his profile as rigid as a statue. It wasn't until they were back in the penthouse, the doors clicking shut against the world, that the tension finally broke. Jinwook shed his overcoat, his movements weary. He moved toward the sideboard to pour a drink, but his hands, usually so steady, fumbled with the crystal decanter. Talia watched him from the center of the room. She was still wearing the red silk dress, now stained at the hem with the grime of the docks, but she didn't feel like a victim anymore. She felt like an observer of a collapsing star. "You're hurt," she said softly. He didn't turn. "It's nothing. Blood that isn't mine." "Your hand," she insisted, stepping closer. He finally looked down. His right hand was trembling, the leather of his glove split across the knuckles. With a frustrated huff, he ripped the gloves off and tossed them onto the table. His skin was raw, split, and swelling. Talia didn't wait for an invitation. She walked to the kitchen, returned with a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth, and sat on the edge of the leather sofa. "Sit," she commanded. For a second the Mafia boss flared in his eyes, the urge to refuse, to remain untouchable. But the weight of the night seemed to pull at his shoulders. He sank into the chair opposite her. Talia reached out and took his hand. His skin was burning hot against her cool touch, his palm large enough to swallow both of hers. Up close, the tattoos on his wrist were intricate, thorns and ink that disappeared beneath his cuff. As she began to dab at the bruised skin, Jin-wook's breath hitched. He didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers instinctively curled around hers, not in a display of strength, but in a desperate, grounding grip. The tattooed grip that usually signaled a death sentence felt, in this moment, like a plea for anchor. "Hana used to hate the violence," he whispered, his voice cracking, the icy facade finally showing a hairline fracture. "She would cry if I came home like this. She wanted me to be a different man, a man who didn't exist." Talia looked up, her gaze steady. "I'm not crying, Jin-wook. I'm cleaning the wound. There's a difference." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time the ghost of Hana wasn't between them. He saw the fire in Talia's eyes, the strength in her hands, and the crown of her afro backlit by the city lights. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, a slow, reverent movement. "You aren't made of glass," he admitted, his voice a ghost of a sound. "You're made of something much more dangerous." He leaned forward, his forehead almost touching hers, the scent of whiskey and lilies